Hello and welcome to our second lecture in Civic Ecology. Today we will be talking about global change, a phenomenon largely associated with human occupation and domination of the global environment. The lecture will be divided in 3 episodes. On episode 1, we'll talk about a time of accelerating change. In episode 2, we're going to talk about an emerging paradigm called the planetary boundary, and we will finish the lecture with an interview. In episode 1, you will learn the dimension of the human impact on the global environment in an age of accelerating change, as well as the 4 spikes of global change. Episode 1 is structured in 3 parts. In part 1, we're going to talk about the sweeping global changes. In part 2 of episode 1, we're going to talk about the 4 episodes of change and finish with a conclusion. Human impacts on the global natural environment has increased dramatically in the 20th century due primarily to increases in, first, human population. Our growing hunger for resources and exploitative economic systems are damaging the Earth's life support systems. The second, the scale of human agency or activities such as industry, agriculture, extraction of natural resources, changes in land use, for example, the clearing of forests for agriculture, for urbanization, can dramatically disrupt the functioning of ecosystems and affect the chemistry of the atmosphere. Climate change is just the tip of the iceberg. Many linked environmental, socioeconomic, and cultural changes are sweeping rapidly across the entire planet. For example, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Earth's land surface has been transformed by human action. More atmospheric nitrogen is at the present time fixed by human activity than by any natural terrestrial source combined. As you know, by nitrogen fixation, I mean the transformation of molecular nitrogen present in the atmosphere, Na2, into ammonia, NH3. Carbon dioxide, for example, in the atmosphere has increased by nearly 30% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. So this has led us to what the environmentalist from the World Watch Institute, Ed Ayers, in his well-known book, God's Last Offer, published in 2000, called a time of accelerating change. So according to Ayers, we have 4 interrelated spikes, exponential increase in activities that have contributed dramatically to global change. Those are, first, an increase in atmospheric CO2, which Ayers refers to as the atmospheric CO2 spike. Second, the extinction spike. Third, the consumption spike. And fourth, the population spike, which is related to the 3 other spikes and actually make them worse. Let's start by taking a look at the atmospheric CO2 spike. We start by referring to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii is an observatory in the United States. They have been recording CO2 concentration in the atmosphere since 1959. So if you take a look at the graph on the right, you see an increase in CO2 levels measured in parts per million from the start of measurement back in 1959 to present time. For you to have an idea of the changes which are taking place at the present moment, CO2 levels, for example, in September 2011, the average for September was 389 parts per million. 1 year later, September 2012, The monthly average was 391.05 parts per million and continues going up. This is another way of looking at the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The graph on the left shows you monthly values, and the bar is showing the annual value. So as you can see, there is a consistent increase in CO2 levels from the beginning of CO2 monitoring in the laboratory, in the Mauna Loa laboratory. The graph on the right shows more recent monthly means of CO2 levels at Mauna Loa laboratory. As you can see, again, the trend that goes from about 2006, 2008 to all the way to 2013. There is the regular oscillation, monthly oscillation, but there is what is important for us to pay attention here is the trend, the upward trend that determines or indicates an increase in CO2 content in the atmosphere. One important thing here that we can learn from this graph again is showing again relationship of atmospheric CO2 concentration per year. As you can see, from more or less 1,000 all the way to about 1800s, the CO2 concentration level in the atmosphere was more or less constant, around 280 parts per million. However, from 1800, it started going up all the way to about 340 measured in 2000. One important thing that I want to call your attention for in this graph here are these different points, because we can here make an association of the continuing increase in CO2 levels with some events that are related to this rise in CO2. For example, if we look at point 1, the beginning of the rise in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, it coincides with the shift from wood burning to fossil fuel burning. Also, and then in the more or less 1900s, the first cars appears, point number 2. Point number 3, in 1980s, is when scientists suspected the link between increases in CO2 emissions and increases in global temperature or global warming. By 1997, point number 4, the Kyoto Protocol was signed, an international agreement for the developed nations of the world to reduce their emissions of CO2. And an important point here that should not be forgotten is by 2001, the Bush administration withdrew the US support of the Kyoto Agreement. This graph here I want to show you, it shows us data from Antarctic ice core data. What I call your attention here is the blue line represents temperature, and the red line represents CO2 concentration. So what I want to show from this graph here is the tight relationship between temperature and CO2 levels. Therefore, the increase of CO2 levels is directly, we can conclude from this observation, directly connected to rise in temperature. This graph also is important to show us how the rate of temperature has increasing throughout time. We have plotted here a difference in temperature with year for different periods. For example, if you look at the red line, this is the trend for temperature rise in the atmosphere in 150 years. As you can see, it has a slow slope because it says that the temperature increased by 0.045 to 0.012. If we take a shorter period, for example, 100 years, you'll see that the increase in temperature, the rate of change, increased a little bit from 0.074 to 0.016, all the way up to the yellow, which is the rate of temperature increase when considered in a period of about 25 years. So here we see that it varies from 0.177 to about 0.052. So there is no question that the temperature the global mean temperature is rising, and that global temperature rise is directly connected with the increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Next, I would like to move to the next spike. This is what we call the extinction spike. When you look at the headlines in the last quarter of the 20th century, we see it's all over the world. For example, the International Union for Conservation of Nature had a headline, 1/4 of all mammal species face extinction soon. The Associated Press said, another headline from the Associated Press, that monkeys, apes, are being eaten to extinction. The Worldwide Federation report registered mass extinction of freshwater creatures. According to Nature, a respected scientific magazine, 90% of all large fish gone from the world's oceans. The Boston Globe reported that amphibians are declining worldwide. The Australian broadcast company said that thousands of medicinal plants being harvested to extinction. Again, the UNCN reported that 25% of the world's conifers are threatened with extinction. So it's everywhere. Everywhere you can read about, and it seems that scientists have an agreement about the mass extinction which we are facing at the current time. This graph here shows us very interesting information related to the extinction spike. As you can see, in all major oceans in the world, the catch has been dramatically dropping per year. So there is a drop in all major oceans, the temperate Pacific, the tropical Pacific, tropical Indian, tropical Atlantic. So it's a trend that has been observed in all major oceans of the world. This other graph here is also important, that is relating two spikes, one that we are talking about at the moment and one that we're going to talk about next, is the relationship between species extinction and human population. You can see throughout the year, the time, we have the orange line is indicating species extinction, and the blue line is indicating population growth. So you can see from this graph the close association between the increase in human population and the extinction rate. And why is that so? Well, it would be expected, as we said, with the increase in global population, increase the demand for food, fiber, water, and urbanization, and the expansion of urbanization, and this all result in change in land cover, in the perturbation, destruction of habitats, and the destruction of habitats have a strong influence on the species extinction. The one important aspect also related to species extinction is the selective disappearance of megafauna. By megafauna, I mean big animals across America, Europe, and Australia. For you to have an idea, any animal weighing more than 1,000 kilograms have been 100% extinct. They are not among us anymore. Animals weighing between 100 and 1,000 kilograms have been extinct by 75%. So we have about 25% of them left. 41% of the herbivores weighing between 5 and 100 kilograms are extinct. And less than 2% of herbivores weighing less than 5 kilograms. Therefore, it's important to note here about how the selective disappearance or extinction of species have been taking place since humans start the occupation and the domination of the global environment. Next, let's move to the third spike, one important spike, which we call the consumption spike. In 2000, the number of recently emerged new consumers was estimated at 1 billion. At that time, they joined 850 million long-established consumers. But what do we call new consumers? What are you referring to? The new consumers are considered persons with a purchasing power of at least $2,500 per year. Most of these new consumers come from the developing or transition countries. For example, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, the Philippines, Turkey, Thailand, etc. One important aspect to note here is that the most significant environmental impact associated with consumerism comes from a diet shift towards meat and the increase in cars. For you to have an idea how a diet shift towards meat can affect dramatically the global environment, I'll give you some numbers. So 1.28 billion cattle occupy nearly 24% of the Earth's land mass. They weigh together more than the entire human population. The Discover magazine, popular science American magazine, published in its October 2012 edition a prognosis about meat consumption by 2062, 50 years from now. They estimated the meat consumption in 2012 about 270 million tons. And by 2062, human population will be consuming about 407 million tons. This is really a challenge. It's gonna be a huge challenge for the global environment. Why? Because most production consumes, meat production, consumes vastly more water and produce far more greenhouse gases, about 70%, than crop foods. For you to have an idea, it takes about 300 cubic meters of water to produce 1 ton of vegetables, 9,000 cubic meters of water to produce 1 ton of nuts, and 15,400 cubic meters of water to produce 1 ton of beef. So the impact of the shift in diet towards meat cannot be neglected or forgotten. The consumption spike has caused direct or indirect impacts upon the global environment. For example, forests have been converted to pasture or production of cattle feed. Desertification of marginal rangelands, which are lands with poor soils, with low productivity in semi-arid and arid regions, as the pressure increases for increase in agricultural production. So the agricultural fields expand to less appropriate areas such as marginal rangelands and semi-arid and arid regions. The production of greenhouse gases, CO2, for example, methane and nitrous oxygen, result from this conversion of pasture to productive cattle feed. Decreased water quality through runoff from fertilized fields and feedlots, and the introduction of invasive species. So these are some of the consequences directly associated with the global environment as related to a shift in diet towards meat. The last and equally important spike observed in the last quarter of the 20th century is what we call the human population spike. So the graph here is showing a tendency in the increase of human population. We are expecting to reach about 9 billion people by the year 2050. So the blue area represents the increasing population in the developing poorer world, and the orange represent the developed or industrial world. For you to have an idea how population has been growing dramatically during the past 100 years, by 1930, we had the population of the Earth was about 2 billion. In 1975, it went up to approximately 4 billion. In 1992, we had about 5.5 billion. And more recently, in February 2013, we have reached the level of 7.07 billion and continue climbing. Population has been growing steadily since the end of the Black Death pandemics around the year of 1400 in Europe. Most significant increase in the last 50 years has been mainly due to advances in medical science and increases in agricultural productivity. According to a UN 2010 revision, the population projection for the world will peak at 10.1 billion in the year 2100, compared to 7 billion in 2011. You have the reference below to check this document published by UN. However, some experts dispute the UN's forecast and have argued that birth rates will fall below replacement rate around 2020. According to these forecasters, population growth will be only sustained until about 2040 by rising longevity, but will peak below 9 billion by 2050. In summary, in the last quarter of the 20th century, our planet entered a period of crisis, ecological, political, economic, greater than any more than the one in the last 300 years. In ecological terms, probably more catastrophic than any for thousands of years. As our technology and productivity continually grows, humans have caused unprecedented alteration in the function of the natural environment to meet growing demands for food, fiber, fresh water, and energy. In conclusion, the human occupation and domination of the global environment has caused depletion of finite resources and other harmful and permanent effects on the environment, such as overfished oceans, pesticides in ground and surface water, ozone holes, rising extinction rates as associated with habitat destruction due to land use change, deforestation and desertification, soil erosion, and massive presence of pollutants in the atmosphere. For self-study, we suggest to you to take a look at the lecture, episode 1, and try to answer these 3 questions. First, in your opinion, what factors have contributed the most to increase the human impact on the global environment in the 20th century? Second, how does an increasing diet shift towards meat will impact the global environment in the future? What factors? How? I mentioned some of them here in the lecture. You can think of some others. And also, I'd like you to try to explain how, for example, the conversion of forests to pasture can contribute to climate change. In the next episode, we will talk about an emerging concept called planetary boundaries, a framework that can help us to face the global problems and all the environmental issues we are currently confronted with. See you next time.